Forget what the movies showed you. Real frontiersmen didn't strut around with shiny leather and polished brass. They carried their guns in rigs that were hidden, improvised, and sometimes deadly to the man wearing them. These were holsters born from desperation, not decoration, designed to solve one problem only: staying alive. Today, we're digging up 20 gun rigs that history buried, the forgotten designs used by cowboys, outlaws, and lawmen who trusted their gear more than luck. Number 20. The contoured flap holster, the military workhorse. Before open-top holsters ruled the frontier, there was a design that prioritized protection over speed. The contoured flap holster was standard issue for U.S. cavalry troops during the 1860s and 70s, and it survived the transition to civilian life better than most military gear. The design was simple but effective: a thick cowhide pouch, molded wet around a specific revolver, with a full leather flap that buckled over the hammer. That flap kept out rain, dust, and trail grit that could foul a percussion cap or jam a cartridge. Troopers riding through Arizona Territory or the Dakota Badlands needed their sidearms to fire after days of hard riding, not just look good on parade. Saddlers at military outposts like Fort Laramie and Fort Worth built these rigs by the hundreds. Most were plain and unmarked, built for function alone. But the contoured fit was the key. Unlike generic pouches, these holsters gripped the revolver's frame so tightly that even a full gallop wouldn't shake it loose. The trade-off was obvious. That protective flap made the draw painfully slow. In a sudden ambush, fumbling with a buckle could get you killed. That's why, as the frontier evolved and gunfights moved from open plains to crowded saloons, the flap holster faded from civilian use. But while the flap holster prioritized protection, the next rig on our list took a completely different approach, one that would influence Western leatherwork for decades. Number 19. The threaded loop rig, the ancestor of the Mexican loop. Long before the Mexican loop became the iconic cowboy holster, frontier saddlers were experimenting with a cruder version that history mostly forgot. The threaded loop rig was an early attempt to secure a holster to a belt without bulky hardware, and it laid the groundwork for everything that came after. Appearing in the late 1860s, the design used a single wide strip of leather, threaded through slots cut into the holster's back. This created a flexible mounting system that distributed weight better than simple belt loops. Cowboys and drovers on the Chisholm Trail found it more comfortable during long hours in the saddle, and the lack of metal buckles meant nothing dug into their sides. Makers in San Antonio, Santa Fe, and El Paso turned out these rigs for Colt Navy and Army revolvers. The craftsmanship varied wildly. Some were beautifully tooled with floral patterns. Others were rough saddle scraps stitched together by firelight. The threaded loop worked, but it had limits. The leather slots stretched over time, causing the holster to sag and shift. When Mexican and Texan saddlers refined the design into the true Mexican loop during the 1870s, the threaded version quietly disappeared. A few originals survive in private collections, and the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum. They're crude, worn, and forgotten, but they represent the first step toward the holster that defined the West. Number 18. The boot, top holster, the hidden backup. Not every gun on the frontier rode on a man's hip. Some were tucked where no one would think to look. The boot-top holster gave cowboys, gamblers, and lawmen a concealed backup weapon that could turn the tide when a primary gun ran dry or jammed. The design was a small leather sleeve sewn inside the boot shaft, positioned to grip a short-barreled revolver or derringer just below the knee. A man could reach down, yank the pistol free, and fire before an opponent realized he was still armed. It wasn't fast, but in a world where most gunfights happened at card tables or barroom floors, having a hidden second chance was worth everything. Gamblers on Mississippi riverboats and in Denver's Tenderloin district favored boot rigs for Remington derringers and Colt cloverleaf house pistols. Lawmen like Dallas Staudenmeier reportedly kept backup pieces in their boots during his violent tenure in El Paso. The rigs were custom work, usually built by cobblers rather than saddlers. Quality varied. A poorly fitted holster could shift during a walk and dump your gun onto a saloon floor at the worst possible moment. Authentic boot holsters are nearly impossible to find today because they were discarded with the boots they were sewn into. But for the men who carried them, they were life insurance, stitched in leather. Number 17. The money belt rig, hidden in plain sight. In frontier towns where open carry was banned or simply drew too much attention, some men turned to an ingenious solution. The money belt rig hid a small pistol inside a wide leather belt, designed to look like it held nothing but coins. These belts were typically 3 to 4 inches wide, with a concealed pocket sewn along the inside. A Colt 1849 pocket revolver or a small Smith & Wesson tip-up fit perfectly, lying flat against the abdomen. The outer surface was plain or lightly tooled to resemble an ordinary money belt, the kind travelers used to protect cash from pickpockets. Merchants, gamblers, and traveling businessmen favored this setup in towns like Dodge City and Tombstone, where city ordinances banned visible weapons but the streets were still dangerous. The gun stayed hidden until the moment it was needed. The draw was awkward, requiring a man to reach under his coat and fish the pistol from a tight pocket. Speed was impossible, but for someone who valued discretion over quick-draw heroics, it was perfect. Surviving examples are rare and often mistaken for simple money belts. A few reside in the Kansas State Historical Society and private collections, their hidden pockets collapsed and overlooked. They remind us that not every armed man on the frontier advertised the fact. Number 16. The skeleton holster, the minimalist speed rig. While most holsters wrap the revolver in leather from muzzle to cylinder, one radical design stripped away everything unnecessary. The skeleton holster was a minimalist rig that held the gun with nothing but a frame of rawhide or thin leather straps, and it was built for one purpose only: speed. Appearing in the 1870s in California and Texas, the skeleton holster used a rigid throat and an open cage that gripped only the trigger guard and barrel tip. The cylinder and most of the frame sat exposed. A shooter could rip the gun free with almost no resistance, shaving precious fractions of a second off his draw. Stage line guards and professional gamblers experimented with skeleton rigs when they needed an edge in close-quarter confrontations. The lack of material also made them lighter and cooler in desert heat. But the design had critical flaws. With so much of the gun exposed, dust and grit fouled the action quickly. The open framework offered no protection if a man fell from a horse or took a hard knock, and without a full pouch to grip, the revolver could shift and rattle loose on a hard ride. Few skeleton holsters survived because their minimal construction wore out fast. Originals are virtually non-existent, but period catalogs from San Francisco leather dealers confirm they were sold, if briefly. Number 15. The reversed cavalry draw, the butt forward carry. Most holsters position the revolver grip facing backward, but some frontier riders flip the setup entirely. The reversed cavalry draw placed the gun butt forward on the dominant side, and it changed how mounted men fought from the saddle. The reasoning was simple. A cavalryman reaching across his body to draw could grab the grip naturally with his palm facing down, allowing a smooth, sweeping motion that cleared the holster and brought the barrel on target in one move. It mimicked the saber draw that military men had trained for years to perfect. U.S. cavalry units used this orientation during the 1860s and 70s, and veterans carried the habit into civilian life. Cowboys and scouts who spent most of their days mounted found the butt-forward position easier than twisting their wrist to grip a rearward-facing handle. Wild Bill Hickok was photographed with his Navy Colts worn butt-forward in a sash, and several Texas Rangers adopted similar setups. The downside was ground fighting. If a man was on foot and needed a fast side draw, the reversed position felt awkward and slow. That's why the style faded as frontier life moved off horseback and into town streets. Surviving reversed holsters often confuse collectors who assume they've been worn backward by mistake. Number 14. The clamshell holster, the full enclosure design. In country where rain, river crossings, and blowing sand could destroy a revolver in hours, some men demanded total protection. The clamshell holster enclosed the entire weapon in a two-piece leather shell that buckled shut, sealing it from the elements. Developed in the 1860s for military use, the design featured a rigid front and back piece, hinged along one side and secured with a strap or buckle on the other. Opening it required both hands, but once sealed, not a speck of dust or a drop of water could reach the gun. Army quartermasters issued clamshell rigs for Patterson, and dragoon revolvers carried on long campaigns through the Southwest deserts and Pacific Northwest rain. Civilian scouts and surveyors adopted similar designs when venturing into territory where a rusted or fouled sidearm meant death. But total protection came at a heavy cost. The clamshell was the slowest holster on the frontier. In an ambush or sudden gunfight, a man would be dead before he got the shell open. That made it useless for anyone expecting close combat. By the 1870s, as gunfighting tactics demanded speed, the clamshell vanished from common use. A few originals survive in the Smithsonian and the Springfield Armory Museum. Their leather dried and cracked, relics of a time when keeping your gun dry mattered more than keeping it fast. Number 13. The shoulder harness rig, the concealed cross draw. Long before detectives and federal agents made shoulder holsters standard, frontier lawmen and undercover operatives used a similar concept to hide serious firepower under a coat. The shoulder harness rig hung a revolver beneath the arm on a leather strap system that crossed the back, and it kept a man armed without anyone knowing. The design emerged in the early 1870s, influenced by European military holsters and adapted by American gunsmiths for the civilian market. A revolver, usually a Colt Navy or a smaller pocket model, hung muzzle down in a leather pouch secured to a harness worn over the shoulders. The shooter reached across his chest, gripped the butt, and pulled downward to clear the holster. Pinkerton agents and Wells Fargo detectives working undercover reportedly favored shoulder rigs because they could sit in a saloon or ride a train without their weapon printing through their clothes. Gamblers who wanted firepower but couldn't risk the attention of a belt gun also turned to shoulder carry. The rigs required tailoring. A poorly fitted harness shifted constantly and made the gun impossible to find under stress. Leather straps dug into shoulders during long wear. Original frontier shoulder holsters are exceptionally rare. A few survive in the Autry Museum and private collections, still attached to the rotted harnesses that held them. Number 12. The belly band, the working man's concealment. For men who couldn't afford a fancy holster or needed to hide a gun under rough work clothes, the belly band offered a simple, cheap solution. It was nothing more than a wide strip of cloth or soft leather wrapped around the abdomen, with a pocket to hold a small revolver against the body. Farmers, miners, and laborers across the frontier used belly bands when they needed protection, but couldn't wear an obvious gun belt. A Colt pocket revolver or a Remington Derringer sat flat against the stomach, invisible under a loose shirt or coat. The band's soft material was more comfortable than stiff leather during long hours of physical work. The design required no gunsmith or saddler. A man could sew one himself from scrap fabric in an evening. That accessibility made it common among the working poor who faced the same dangers as wealthy ranchers, but lacked the money for quality gear. The drawbacks were serious. Cloth stretched and shifted, making the gun's position unpredictable. Sweat soaked the fabric and could foul a percussion revolver. Drawing was slow and clumsy, often requiring a man to lift his shirt entirely. Almost no original belly bands survived because they were made from perishable materials and thrown away when they wore out. But written accounts and diary entries confirm they were everywhere. Number 11. The swivel holster, the seated draw solution. For men who spent their lives sitting, whether on a wagon bench, a stagecoach seat, or a saloon chair, traditional holsters were a nightmare. The swivel holster solved that problem with a simple mechanical innovation. The design mounted the holster pouch on a metal pivot attached to the belt loop. This allowed the entire holster to rotate forward when the wearer sat down, keeping the grip accessible instead of buried against a chair back. When the man stood, the holster swung back to its normal vertical position. Stagecoach drivers and shotgun messengers were early adopters in the 1870s. They spent hours on a hard bench with their hands full of reins or a scattergun, and a standard holster jammed against the seat made their revolver nearly impossible to reach. The swivel gave them a fighting chance if road agents appeared. Teamsters hauling freight across the plains used similar setups for the same reason. A gun you can't reach is just dead weight. The swivel mechanism added complexity and cost. The pivot point was a potential failure, and dust could jam the rotation. Most frontier users couldn't afford or maintain such a rig, limiting its spread. Surviving swivel holsters are extremely rare, but a few are held in the Wells Fargo History Museum, their pivots still functional after more than a century. Number 10. The tandem rig, 2 guns, 1 holster. Carrying 2 revolvers usually meant wearing 2 holsters, but a few frontier makers experimented with combining them. The tandem rig held 2 pistols stacked in a single oversized pouch, giving a shooter a backup weapon without doubling his belt. Hardware. The design placed 1 revolver in front of the other, grips angled for sequential draws. A man would pull the front gun first, use it until empty, then draw the second without fumbling for a separate holster. In theory, it offered the firepower of dual carry, with the streamlined profile of a single rig. Professional gunfighters and bodyguards who expected prolonged engagements tested tandem rigs during the 1870s and 80s. Having 12 shots immediately available without reloading was a significant advantage when facing multiple opponents, but the concept had serious problems. The doubled weight dragged heavily on the belt and threw off a rider's balance. Drawing the rear gun while the front pouch was still there created snag points, and the bulk made concealment impossible. The tandem rig never caught on widely and disappeared by the 1890s. Only a handful of original examples exist, mostly in private collections. They represent an evolutionary dead end, a clever idea that couldn't overcome its own awkwardness. Number 9. The Spanish loop. The vaquero influence. Before Texas cowboys developed their own leather traditions, they borrowed heavily from the Mexican vaqueros, who had worked cattle in the Southwest for generations. The Spanish loop was one of those borrowed designs, and it shaped American holster making for decades. The rig featured a wide, flat loop of leather sewn to the holster back, designed to slide over a broad sash or belt worn high on the waist. Unlike American belt loops that hung the gun at the hip, the Spanish loop positioned the revolver almost at the rib cage. This kept it clear of a rider's leg and closer to the hand. Vaqueros in California and South Texas wore Spanish loop holsters for Colt dragoons and navies during the 1850s and 60s. Anglo ranchers who worked alongside them adopted the style and carried it north along the cattle trails. The high ride wasn't just tradition. It kept the heavy revolvers of that era from bouncing against the thigh during hard riding. It also made drawing easier while seated in a vaquero's deep-seated saddle. As American saddlers refined the design, they lowered the ride and adapted it to narrower belts, eventually creating the California pattern and the Mexican loop. But the Spanish original, with its high position and broad loop, was the seed that started it all. Authentic Spanish loop holsters survive in California mission collections and the Autry Museum. Number 8. The angled butt-forward rig, the ergonomic draw. Most holsters hung a revolver straight up and down, but some frontier makers tilted the pouch forward at a sharp angle. The angled butt-forward rig positioned the grip almost horizontally, pointing toward the shooter's opposite hand, and it changed the geometry of the draw entirely. The idea was ergonomic. By canting the holster forward, the grip met the hand at a natural angle, reducing the wrist twist required to pull the gun and level it on target. A smooth, scooping draw replaced the choppy lift-and-rotate motion of a vertical holster. Texas brush country riders and Kansas lawmen experimented with these angled rigs during the 1870s. In thick mesquite or during a fast dismount, a gun that cleared leather smoothly could save your life. Saddlers in Fort Worth and San Antonio built custom versions, often paired with the Mexican loop or California pattern. The angle varied based on the customer's arm length and draw style. The trade-off was retention. An angled holster didn't grip the gun as securely during rough riding. Men using this setup often added a hammer thong or a tension screw to keep the revolver from bouncing loose. Few angled rigs survived intact because they were custom pieces that wore out with their owners. Those that remained show heavy use and deliberate craftsmanship. Number 7. The cavalry pommel holster, the mounted fighting system. Before belt holsters became standard, mounted troops carried their revolvers on the saddle itself. The cavalry pommel holster was a leather pouch attached directly to the saddle's pommel, positioning the weapon for a quick grab while riding at full gallop. Developed during the 1840s and 50s for massive Colt Walker and Dragoon revolvers, The pommel holster solved a basic problem. Those early handguns weighed over 4 pounds and were simply too heavy to hang from a belt during a long campaign. Strapping them to the saddle kept the weight off the rider and the gun within easy reach. U.S. Dragoons and Texas Rangers used pommel setups throughout the Mexican-American War and into the Indian Wars. The holsters came in pairs, one on each side of the horn, though most men carried just one revolver. The design kept the gun protected with a full flap and secured with a buckle or thong. A rider could reach forward, pop the flap, and draw while staying mounted. When lighter revolvers like the Colt Navy appeared in the 1850s, belt carry became practical and the pommel holster faded. But for a generation of mounted fighters, it was the only way to pack a hand cannon. Original pommel holsters survive in the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and the Cody Firearms Museum. They're leather-shaped by decades of contact with sweat-soaked saddle horns. Number 6. The integrated cartridge system, belt and holster as one. Most gun belts were just belts with loops added for cartridges, but some frontier makers fused the holster and ammunition carrier into a single integrated system, creating a rig where leather, bullets, and weapon worked as one unit. These integrated cartridge systems emerged in the late 1870s after metallic cartridges became standard. Saddlers stitched the holster directly to a belt lined with caliber-specific loops, ensuring the gun and its ammunition were always together. A man grabbed his rig, buckled it on, and had everything he needed. Texas Rangers and professional shootists favored integrated systems because they eliminated fumbling with separate gear. In a sudden fight, knowing exactly where your spare rounds were could be the difference between reloading and dying. The best examples came from makers in El Paso, Dallas, and San Antonio. They used double-layer skirting leather for strength and hand-cut each cartridge loop to grip the brass tightly without binding. The design's weakness was adaptability. An integrated system built for .45 caliber was useless if you switched to a .38, and if the holster wore out, the whole belt went with it. Despite these limits, the integrated system became the foundation for the classic cowboy gun belt that Hollywood later immortalized. The originals, scarred and sweat-darkened, survive in museums across the Southwest. Number 5. The Montana Pattern Rig. The cold-weather carry frontier holsters were designed for dust and heat. But men in the Northern Territories needed something that worked in brutal cold. The Montana Pattern Rig was built for winter, with features that let a man draw his gun while wearing heavy gloves. Developed in the 1880s by saddlers in Montana and Wyoming, the pattern featured an enlarged trigger guard opening and a deeper, wider pouch that accommodated a gloved hand. The throat was flared to guide a bulky grip into place when reholstering without looking. Everything about the design assumed the shooter couldn't feel his fingers. Ranchers, wolfers, and lawmen in towns like Helena and Cheyenne carried Montana pattern rigs through winters that dropped to 40 below. A standard holster would have been useless. Stiff leather jammed. Narrow openings caught on wool and fur. Makers often lined Montana rigs with sheepskin or felt to prevent the revolver from freezing to the leather. They also used heavier hardware that wouldn't crack in extreme cold. The pattern never spread south because it wasn't needed, and examples are rare outside northern collections. The Buffalo Bill Center of the West holds several, their leather still supple from decades of oil treatment against harsh conditions. Number 4. The Cutaway Speed Holster. The exposed trigger rig. Some men wanted speed so badly, they were willing to carry a cocked revolver with the trigger completely exposed. The Cutaway Speed Holster did exactly that, carving away the leather around the trigger guard to allow instant access to a gun that was ready to fire. The design appeared in the 1870s among professional gunfighters and law enforcement officers who valued the first shot above all else. The revolver sat with the hammer back and the trigger exposed to the open air. A shooter didn't need to clear leather and then fire. He could squeeze the trigger the instant his hand found the grip. Dodge City deputies and hired guns in the Lincoln County War reportedly tested these rigs when they expected imminent violence. The advantage was undeniable. Against an opponent using a conventional holster, the cutaway user fired first nearly every time. But the danger was catastrophic. A stumble, a brush against a doorframe, or a nervous horse could set off the round. Men shot themselves in the leg, the foot, and worse. The same newspapers that praised quick-draw artists reported gruesome accidents from exposed triggers. By the late 1880s, the design had largely disappeared. The risk simply wasn't worth the speed. A few cutaway holsters survive in private collections, their leather trimmed back to the edge of the cylinder. They're reminders that the frontier sometimes rewarded recklessness, until it didn't. Number 3, the Bridgeport rig, the speed holster, too dangerous to be legal. In 1882, a Connecticut inventor named Louis S. Flatow received U.S. patent number 258,640 for a device he called a pistol holder. He meant to revolutionize the quick draw. Instead, he created something so dangerous it was banned within a few years. The Bridgeport rig used a spring-loaded steel clip that clamped around the trigger guard of a Colt single-action army. The revolver hung naked on the belt with no leather pouch, no safety strap, hammer back, and trigger exposed. A shooter could twist, draw, and fire in one continuous motion. Dealers like Hartley and Graham of New York listed the Bridgeport in their 1884 catalog, advertising instant readiness for the frontier marksman. A few scouts, deputies, and Wells Fargo guards tried it. Within months came the accidents: a stumble, a startled horse, a man brushing against a doorway. Each could set off the exposed weapon. Kansas newspapers reported deputies shooting themselves mounting wagons. Town ordinances in Dodge City and Tombstone soon discouraged the device. By the late 1880s, the Bridgeport had vanished from catalogs. Only a handful survive today in the Cody Firearms Museum and the NRA National Firearms Collection. Their steel clips are warped and worn. 50 years later, Hollywood copied its silhouette for movie props, turning a failed invention into a legend. The real gunfighters had already learned the lesson. Speed means nothing if your holster kills you first. Number 2, the tie-down rig, the real quick draw setup. Forget the myths about slapping leather and fanning hammers. If a frontiersman actually expected a fast draw, he used a tie-down rig. This was the genuine quick draw setup, and it was all about keeping the holster locked in place while the gun came out clean. The concept was simple. A leather thong ran from the bottom of the holster to a loop around the thigh, anchoring the pouch so it wouldn't rise when the shooter yanked upward on the grip. Without a tie-down, pulling hard on a revolver often lifted the whole holster off the belt, costing precious time and fouling the draw. Professional gunfighters and lawmen who practiced their draw relentlessly understood this problem. Tying down the holster turned a snag into a smooth release. Combined with a well-fitted open-top pouch, the tie-down let a man clear leather in fractions of a second. The style appeared in the 1870s and remained in use through the end of the frontier era. It was common among men who made their living with a gun, from hired shootists to town marshals. Photographs of working lawmen from Dodge City and Tombstone show the thong clearly. Though dime novels and later films usually ignored it, authentic tie-down rigs survive in several museum collections. Their thongs dried and brittle. They represent the closest thing the real West had to the Hollywood fast draw, a functional system built for men who couldn't afford to lose. Number 1. The Ranger Belt and Holster Combo, the real gunslinger setup. Before Hollywood dressed heroes in silver conchos and drop loops, the men who actually lived by the gun trusted one rig above all others. The Ranger Belt and Holster Combo was the pinnacle of frontier engineering, the rig that earned the name Gunslinger. Developed in Texas during the 1870s, the system evolved from the cartridge belts used by Texas Rangers, who needed something stronger than the thin civilian straps sold back east. A typical Ranger belt was 2 layers of thick skirting leather stitched together with raw hide or riveted with brass to prevent stretching in the heat. Between those layers ran a full row of cartridge loops, each hand cut to grip 44 or 45 caliber rounds snugly against the body. Attached to the belt was a high-ride holster closely fitted to a Colt single-action Army, Smith & Wesson Schofield, or Remington revolver. Unlike the low-slung movie rigs, this holster kept the gun high on the hip, angled slightly forward for a natural strong-side draw. It was made for riding, fighting, and surviving, not for show. Rangers like Captain Leander McNelly and John B. Jones were photographed wearing versions of this setup during brutal years of border warfare. The design proved so reliable that commercial makers began offering Ranger-style belts by the 1880s. Authentic Ranger belts survive in the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. Their edges are sweat-darkened from decades of use. They weren't props. They were working gear for men whose lives depended on seconds and stitches. If the Hollywood rigs were fantasy, the Ranger belt was reality. The rig that truly made the legend. 20 rigs, from flap holsters to Ranger belts, and everyone tells the same story. The real West wasn't polished, posed, or cinematic. It was practical, improvised, and often desperate. These holsters weren't fashion statements. They were survival equipment. Each design solved a problem that no movie ever shows: keeping a weapon dry, accessible, and ready before a man could blink. Every scar in that leather is a record of engineering under pressure. Hollywood turned them into costumes. History turned them into evidence. And what's left are the originals, darkened with sweat, burned by powder, cut by decades of hard use. That's where the West actually lived. No legends, no myths, just the rigs that armed a generation who didn't need a script to survive.